For centuries, humans have been growing alongside our botanical brethren. Our histories have mixed and mingled to bring us modern medical marvels, faded folklore, and everything in between. Of course, in order to understand the plant, we have to start with its roots. I'm M. Grubner-Gaddis, and this is Rooted. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Lightly Rooted. This week, we're digging into plants and fungi that could double as nightlights. You might remember from the petunia episode that there is a mushroom that's making it possible to make plants glow in the dark. And a ton of these kinds of things are starting to pop up, so I figured today we could spend some time getting to the bottom of it. Starting with what is bioluminescence? I feel like I know enough, but in the way you can use a word correctly without giving an exact definition. So I figured a good place to start is all getting on the same page as to what exactly bioluminescence is. Then we'll dig into that specific mushroom and how splicing it into plants works. Then we'll move on to what different products are coming up onto the market, how other plants might grow and glow in this way, and what new products we might expect to see in the coming years. So starting with what is bioluminescence, let's just give it a quick Google. We're going to start with Wikipedia. Now, again, I know this is not truly the best scientific article, but it's a good place to start, especially when we're talking about doing an internet deep dive. So according to Wikipedia, bioluminescence is the production and emission of light by living organisms, and it's a form of chemiluminescence, with bioluminescence occurring mostly in marine vertebrates and invertebrates, as well as in some fungi, microorganisms, including bioluminescent bacteria, terrestrial arthropods like fireflies, and in some animals, the light is produced by a symbiotic relationship with bacteria. So it's kind of like if you remember in the Lightly Rooted episode we did on animals that photosynthesize, this is kind of the same thing, except instead of photosynthesizing, they can glow in the dark, which is kind of fun. The principal chemical reaction, man, it helps to be able to read, in bioluminescence involves a light-emitting molecule and an enzyme, which is called luciferin, and those are apparently the generic names, which is interesting. And essentially the enzyme in there is catalyzing with oxidation. So that's what's making it glow, is being exposed to the air. And some animals get that just naturally, they can produce it, and others are getting it through the stuff they're eating. And we kind of started figuring this out, it turns out, because Aristotle mentioned that damp wood sometimes kind of glows. And then Robert Boyle eventually was like, that's really weird. But I feel like oxygen's definitely involved, because if we look at wood and we work at glowworms, they're not able to do this in areas where we're not providing them air. So that's kind of how we figured out oxidation. Okay, and this is saying that there's a few different reasons that it's useful in biology to have bioluminescence. The first being that you can kind of mimic other animals to either lure in prey, or maybe let's say you really don't want to be attacked by something that's afraid of cougars. Maybe if you're big enough, you could kind of mimic their eyes. So that's one way that it's really useful. And the other way is to primarily attract mates, which is what we see in fireflies. They're sending out little sexts, kind of "Are you ups" in the sky, I guess. Okay, now we're moving into history. They did touch a little bit in this article on what we're trying to do, and it turns out some people are trying to find a way to leverage this to be street lighting, which could be interesting and maybe a little bit better for the environment, maybe a little bit less harmful to some of our animal friends. And then, of course, as we've touched about in that petunia episode, they are trying to find ways to just make plants grow and glow, but that's more for fun. Okay. Weird fun fact, you guys know I love those. It turns out that before we had safety lamps in coal mines, people used to just bring dried fish skin as a source of light. So I'm just imagining before work on Sunday, you gotta hit up the river really fast, dry out your fish skins, and then you're just like holding those in front of your face. I think that would be like the stinkiest, worst nightlight I've ever heard of, but it's interesting. And this helped them to avoid using candles, which I guess would be pretty important in coal mines. You wouldn't want to risk an explosion or anything like that, or drop a bunch of little sparks somewhere. And they had tried using fireflies as well, but obviously without a ton of air in the coal mine, the fireflies would die pretty quickly, which is not only really sad, but super not useful when you're trying to find your way out of a coal mine. Okay, and now they're kind of talking about how when we started doing like sea exploration, especially deep sea exploration, and even really earlier than that, we would see a lot of marine animals in the water, and it would look like the water was just glowing, but really it was just a crowd of like bioluminescent shrimp or something. So for a really long time, we were not sure what was going on. We were just like, what's this weird glowing shit in the water? Probably it's demons or monsters. And then we started kind of figuring out like, oh, these things are just bioluminescent. I feel like we all have kind of a better understanding of this now. And we know it's primarily found in sea animals and bacteria, but it can also be found in mushrooms. Okay, moving on to the mushroom that we're splicing that genetic code out of. We'll just search mushroom bioluminescence. Alrighty, after a brief intermission, it turns out, not surprisingly, the company isn't super forthcoming about the kind of mushroom exactly that they're splicing in here, but from what I could find on the internet, it seems like they're using Neothampus nambi, which is a poisonous and bioluminescent mushroom in the Maramaceae family, and this is a specific species of fungi that is known for its bioluminescence. So it's not super surprising that they would choose a mushroom from this family, or this mushroom specifically. Now, a little bit more about that mushroom. It is something that we've been studying for a while to pull bioluminescence from, and they're typically found in tropical climates, specifically in South Vietnam, and it supports its bioluminescent capabilities through like a series of different genes that makes it able to kind of sustain itself. So it kind of cycles through specific nutrients that support the health of that bioluminescence, and it's great, like all other mushrooms, for the specific environment that it grows in. And it's believed that they're bioluminescent to actually attract insects at night to help it spread its spores. And specifically, the reason this company uses it is because the person they had working to make bioluminescent plants actually started off studying fireflies and their bioluminescence, and they tried splicing firefly DNA into tobacco plants. That was kind of their earliest experiment for this company, and it worked. And the reason they use tobacco is because tobacco is pretty easy to grow, and it's very receptive. It's easy for us to track its genes. So it's a great choice to have in labs when we're trying to work through genetics. But in splicing the firefly genes into the plant, what they discovered is that it couldn't continuously glow. It really needed like a specific substrate to be constantly injected. So you could get it to glow for a little bit, which was cool, but it wasn't a super bright glow, and they really struggled to get it to be sustaining. And the vision they had for this plant is that you could grow it in your garden like any other plant, and just at night it would glow. So that really wasn't working, and they started thinking through, like what other genes could we use, and they kind of stumbled upon this mushroom. According to an article in the Smithsonian, they had started this specific research into this mushroom, a different lab, in about 2015. And so we started having a better idea of how exactly these genes worked. So the specific chemical that these guys create is called oxyluciferin, and it really was unclear to us how it worked until this 2015 study, where they understood that they kind of glow and that it's to help attract insects to pollinate it because the bugs are spreading their spores. And so essentially, like, a group of scientists went foraging for these mushrooms, brought them back in the lab, crushed them up to make like a gross little mushroom slurry, and they isolated that specific luciferin and studied it and captured the chemical structure to be able to experiment with how it's making those really bright colors. And now they know that they have this specific enzyme that combines with that chemical to trigger light. And because it has this enzyme, it can interact with different luciferins and produce different shades. And it's able to kind of sustain itself because of the energy it's able to absorb. And so that's what the company who makes this glow-in-the-dark petunia, Light Bio, is leveraging. They essentially spliced 4 different genes into the plant that not only enable it to glow the way these mushrooms do, but also sustain that glowing, which is something they couldn't really do when it came to the firefly genes, but they were able to do through this specific mushroom gene. So that's how they've got these plants glowing. And essentially, I was a little surprised to see how quickly the USDA did approve this. So I also did a little Googling on that, and it turns out there was a different petunia. I know, we're getting deep into the plant lore, but I personally love that they had kind of developed. I believe it came out on the market in like 2018, and it was this really luxe orange color that you don't see a lot. And the way they got it to be this orange color is that they actually pulled some DNA from maize, so corn, and they put that directly into the plant. But this was really, really early. Well, not that early, but obviously at this time we were all still very concerned about GMOs. And neither of these petunias are edible, and both companies are very upfront about that. You should not eat any of these. Although the maize one, a lot of folks pointed out, like, maize is edible. All varieties of maize are edible, so it stands to reason that it wouldn't cause any kind of harm. But essentially, some of them got leaked from the lab, which is kind of crazy, like plant leaking. Hilarious. But they were, and so a bunch of nurseries started selling them, and people obviously fell in love with this bright orange petunia, planted it in their gardens, only to have a USDA agent show up and essentially, like, rip it out of their yards. And people were rightfully upset. We should be allowed to kind of grow what we want to grow as long as it's not causing harm and it's being produced ethically. So they kind of call it, like, essentially petunia carnage, where folks were rightfully outraged that people were just coming in and, like, taking their plants that they bought perfectly legally away. And while the USDA obviously knew it wasn't entirely legal, people were really upset. And it kind of triggered this conversation around GMOs and what role they could potentially play in gardening, because obviously, like, people love science and we want to study how these things work. And while I think in the world of GMOs, we have to be considerate of what we're doing to plants and how they're interacting with people and our bodies, because this is entirely new, I think if people want to do it, they should be able to. And the USDA kind of was forced to agree through that one. So then when it came time to approving the firefly petunia, there was just a lot of pressure, especially it's another petunia. So they were more, I guess, cautious about it, but they did say, like, yes, you can sell it. And so it's been being sold since 2023, and it still looks like you can pre-order. I know some were sent out last year, but I'm not sure how many. And on their website right now, you can still pre-order. It's still $29, just like it was last year. And shipments begin, it says, in spring of 2024. So if I click pre-order, you're just immediately sent to checkout. There's not a ton of information about this. And when I click on Light Bio, it looks like the firefly petunia really is their main selling point right now. I'm not sure what else they're on, but they do have restrictions. Obviously, you cannot propagate or breed firefly petunias. This is under patent, so you can't sell it at all, but you can buy it for personal use. All right, so we're also studying bioluminescence as a way to treat cancer, and this is still very new, but essentially the treatment is called bioluminescent activated destruction, and the idea is that if we can make cells glow, specifically like cancer cells, it's easier to spot them and destroy them for our bodies. So that's still very, very experimental. We don't have a ton of research on it, but that's something scientists are currently working on We're also using it, like I said, for bioluminescence imaging, and we're using it to try to crack light production. So essentially the idea here is that bioluminescence is clearly something that nature can sustain. So if we can find a way to crack it, we could have light without putting such a strain on resources that we need, that we're currently leveraging to create light. So we would need less energy, which would be awesome. But we still haven't quite cracked that. We're really working on it, but we haven't found anything that is working, especially when it comes to being sustainable for long periods of time at a price point that most of us could afford, or at the very least, like government level people could afford. The University of Wisconsin-Madison is researching the use of E. coli bacteria, like specifically bioluminescent E. coli, to power a light bulb, which is interesting. I can't find too much more about exactly how that's working, but I am interested to learn more about that one. And currently, there aren't many plants on the market that I know of that do glow. I think now that we've seen that approval from the USDA, it really won't surprise me to see people trying to leverage this. One thing I am interested in is I think a lot of these companies obviously struggle with, like, how can we limit this? Especially we're using a poisonous mushroom to spice into glowing plants right now, which is complicated and confusing. So I think it will take some time, definitely, and a lot more funding. But I think now that the USDA has approved one plant for market, it won't be too long until we start seeing a bunch more. So I'm looking forward to learning more with all of you as this becomes what I believe to be probably the next biggest trend in outdoor plants. With that, I think we're going to cut this episode of Lightly Rooted here, but I look forward to seeing you in our next standard episode of Rooted. See you then. Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to the earth, and just like a plant, drink your water. If you liked the show, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at rooted.pod. We're finally updating regularly on YouTube at rooted.podcast, and you can check out our website, rootedpod.com, for transcripts, updates, merch, and so much more. The show is written, produced, and hosted by me. I'm Grebner Gaddis, edited by Kat Friend of Friend Diagram, and our theme music was written and produced by Eric Cluxon. Rooted is a Henbane Media LLC production.